Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, New York-based TV presenter and podcaster Josh Zepps, the Minister for Employment and Women, Michaelia, Opposition Senate Leader Penny Wong, leading Australian broadcaster Alan Jones, and the co-founder of Mamamia Women's Network, Freedman. Please welcome our panel. OK, pay attention now, because if you're in Queensland, South Australia, the Northern Territory or Western Australia, you can watch Q&A live on ABC News 24 or listen to the simulcast on News Radio. Well, our Facebook audience want us to talk about Mardi Gras, George Pell and foreign ownership. Our first question tonight comes from Nicole Williamson. It's on politics.
Tony, over the past weekend, we've been subject to the unedifying spectacle of the media dissecting the personal relationship of the former Prime Minister and his Chief of Staff. On the eve of International Women's Day, does the panel believe we will ever get to a place where a powerful woman will be judged solely on her performance and not subject to gossip and innuendo about who she's been sleeping with?
Freedman. It has been pretty unedifying, hasn't it?
It has been quite unedifying, but if you read Nikki Sava's book, as I have been, and the two other books that have been written on the subject of the downfall of Tony Abbott, really, to me, it's less about her and more about him, because ultimately he was the Prime Minister. He had the ability to choose his Chief of Staff, and he was involved in a relationship that was so enmeshed and sort of codependent that it really did seem to affect his judgment. And I think the gossip and the innuendo is almost irrelevant. And everything that I've read in these books has very much been, and a lot of people have gone on the record, that was not the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem was that they both seemed to believe that he was incapable of governing without her. And that was ultimately to both their detriment, but his responsibility, not hers.
Just briefly, were you at all disturbed that Nikki Sava did not put any of this to the key people in her book that she was writing about, Tony Abbott and Peter Credlin?
I think that you know, she's answered that by saying that they have the opportunity to talk on the record all the time and
it's
background
journalism
journalists.
101, isn't it?
Yeah.
To put these things to the people you're writing about?
Absolutely. And I think that Peter Credlin and Tony Abbott have both come out and said that they're disappointed and upset that they haven't had the chance to do that. But I wouldn't dismiss her book as scurrilous gossip. There's a lot of on-the-record sources, a huge number of on-the-record sources from coalition existing and former MPs.
Alan Jones.
Well, I agree with the sentiments of the questioner. I will just say this. It does seem that some people are very uncomfortable with powerful women. And I'm always surprised that it's women that seems to be more uncomfortable. You've got to remember that Peter Credlin wasn't just with Tony Abbott yesterday. She was part of that campaign in 2010 when they almost won government. She was part of the campaign which gave them very significant victory in 2013. And she previously worked for Malcolm Turnbull. So the woman has a very, very distinguished record in political organisation. On the other hand, when you get into government, people are jockeying for positions and they want jobs and they don't get jobs and their noses get out of joint, and there does come a time when you have to say to people, I've worked in that environment at that level. I was a senior advisor to a Prime Minister, and people get upset with the decisions you make. Do you lose your temper at times? I suppose you do. Do you use bad language at times? I guess you do. Do you expect that all that's going to be sort of repeated chapter and verse? I think that it's interesting, those who are most scurrilous about Peter Credlin and Tony Abbott are anonymous, and I would have thought that Nikki Sava, she has a history, she doesn't like Tony, that's her business, she can say what she likes, but I've known these two people for a long time. Credlin is a formidable woman, and I think there has to be room, and there must be room in contemporary society for formidable women. There's one running for the presidency of the United States of America. They don't like that. Some people didn't like Peter Credlin, but I think she'll survive all of this because those who know her know she's a woman of ability.
A quick follow-up question, Alan. Do you think the revelations in this book will impact on whatever chances Tony Abbott might have thought he had of becoming Prime Minister again?
Well, firstly, he has no thoughts. I've known Tony Abbott for, God, how long? 30-something years. He has no thoughts of becoming Prime Minister again. He does have thoughts of playing a very constructive role in the future administration of the country, and he has to bide his time. He knows that. we oughtn't to be starting to organise a succession line-up for Malcolm Turnbull. He's the Prime Minister. The party's got to get behind him. On the other hand, Tony will defend his record. And this happened in relation to the submarine issue, and I'm sure that'll come up later. So Tony sought to defend his record in relation to that. A Prime Minister's entitled to do that, and I think he's got a very significant contribution to make, but he'll also be very loyal to the party.
Penny Wong.
Well, very briefly, first, I think the key issue here is the dysfunction at the heart of the government. I'm not particularly interested in details about their relationship, and I haven't read the book, but it seems to me that's not the issue, although that seems to be getting a lot of press. The issue is the dysfunction at the heart of the government.
Are you surprised how much press it's getting, that particular issue?
I am surprised. Well, am I surprised? No, not really. You know, it seems to be the way things are at the moment. I would say I do agree with Alan. There should be a place for formidable women. That probably wasn't the way in which the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard was treated by many people. But my views about you know, Tony Abbott and his government are that there was obviously dysfunction in the heart of the Prime Minister's office. The reasons for that, if they're personal, that's a matter for them, and I'm not particularly interested in sort of trawling through that.
Michaelia Cash.
Well, I'm actually going to agree with Penny Wong there. As a member of the government, I'm not going to comment on what is commentary. I haven't read Nikki Savva's book. You have leadership spills. You know, Penny went through that with Labor. We've gone through it with the Liberal Party. Books are written. I prefer to focus on what we're going to do going forward, and in particular, given that it is International Women's Day, I will say to the questioner, I certainly do believe that there is a place for formidable women. I wouldn't like to think for one moment that because something is written or something is said about a woman, that it detracts from the fantastic job that they can do. So given that it's International Women's Day, I think we can all agree that there should be more women in leadership positions across Australia, and that's what we should all be focusing on.
Yep, but we also need to focus on the story that's become such a huge story over the weekend. So quick, just a quick question. Well, how do you feel about the role of your colleagues, some of your colleagues and Liberal staffers in speaking to Nikki Savva about all of this and opening up this can of worms?
Look, people are entitled to speak to whomever they wish, but I will disagree with you, Tony, in terms of we need to focus. You get to make choices in life about what you focus on. And if you want to focus on the book or the varying books that have been written about the Rudd-Gillard eras, the Abbott era, that's for you. But I'm a policymaker.
In this program, we focus on the questions.
No, absolutely, but I'm a policymaker. I'm a policymaker. It's International Women's Day tomorrow. We have a great story to tell as Australians in terms of what we have achieved. I would hope that we get an opportunity tonight to celebrate what we've achieved as Australians, as women,
we will, and you can,
as opposed to focusing on...
You can even sing us out if you so choose.
Quite frankly, you probably wouldn't enjoy that, but hey. But as I said, I'm a member of the government.
All right.
I'm not going to comment on
Tony,
commentary.
no long-term staffer in that office has spoken against Credlin or Abbott. No person who went through all of that from beginning to end has spoken against either of them.
Josh Zepps.
I feel like we're having the same conversation that we have quite a lot. I come back to Australia fairly regularly, and every time I come back there's a new Prime Minister, and there's a book about why the last Prime Minister was inevitably going to fail, and I turn on Q&A and there's a government minister saying we're firmly behind current Prime Minister. You know, the Yanks call this Monday morning quarterbacking, where you always have a good explanation after the fact for why something didn't work. If John Howard had been ousted in 2001 when he had terrible poll ratings in the first half of that year, then we would all be saying, well, it was inevitable. He was never going to be a long-term Prime Minister. You know, there are always reasons in retrospect why things don't work out. Maybe Credlin was one reason why Abbott didn't work out. Do we particularly care? I'm sort of with the Minister. I'm not really sure we should.
OK, let's move on to our next question, a totally different subject. It's from Ebony Campbell.
Does the panel think George Pell should be removed from his position in the church because of his lack of action over the reported sexual abuse?
Alan Jones, start with you.
Well, I think the first thing is that what the Royal Commission are about is something that would unnerve, disgust and disappoint all Australians. And it's almost too grotesque to even define. Where George Pell fits into this, I think there has been a fairly unfortunate focus on Pell in the sense that he was 28 years of age in 1969, all this happened. And there is a presumption in the way in which this has been conducted that Pell was then the Cardinal and therefore should have done something. Now, I'm not a Catholic, but people in the Catholic Church know that a priest really doesn't have a lot of say. And that was borne out last year in the comments made by the Channel 10 journalist Paul Bongiorno, who was a Catholic priest. And he was in the same seminary as Ridsdale, in the same dormitory. They all slept in a group together. And he made the very pertinent observation. He had no idea any of this was going on. And there was never any suggestion when Ridsdale came in that night that he had been out doing the kind of things that was subsequently established he had to do. Paul Bongiorno's explanation was accepted. Pell's hasn't been. And so I think that he was the first person in either government or the church to do anything about it. The first person he attacked was that fellow Searson, who had behaved abominably, and he told him he would not get a ministry anywhere in the church. He should resign or be sacked. But of course, Pell had to refer that to the Vatican, and the Vatican overruled Pell, or to quote the evidence he cited, the Vatican beat me, or words to that effect. So, you know, Pell then instituted change within the church, sought compensation and so on. I mean, the fact that it's a bit of a Lindy Chamberlain here, I mean, Lindy Chamberlain was guilty because she didn't cry. Pell is this great big man of quiet manner, but very strong, limited personality, limited capacity to engage, and people see him as aggressive and diffident. But I do think we have to remember that I hope they don't ask us what we were doing at 28 years of age. I can't even remember what I did last Monday.
Well, we weren't covering up rapists when we were 28 years old. We weren't covering up rapists.
I think the point that Bongiorno made is that he was there in the same seminary as this bloke.
And Alan, it's so disingenuous to imply that the structures, the power structures within the church are just sort of accidental and don't serve the people who are in power.
Structures. He wasn't responsible for the power structures in 69 years now.
Just quick follow-up, Alan Jones. What did you think about his evidence? You talk about his diffidence. It seemed to go to a lot of people a bit further than diffidence when he said of Gerald Ridsdale's crimes, it was a sad story and not much interest to me.
Yeah. Well, I think he's acknowledged it's an appalling choice of words. I don't know. I'm not here to defend Pell. I'm simply saying I presume that what Pell was, and he sought subsequently to explain that, was that at no time was he aware that Ridsdale was guilty of this heinous behaviour, and therefore Ridsdale was of no interest to him. I mean, Ridsdale was of no interest to a lot of people. And, I mean, it's the fact that all this can go on, and that's the issue, in the church, and nothing at the time was done about it. That's the real concern.
Let's hear from our other panellists. Penny Wong.
Oh, well, I mean, it's been... the Royal Commission has been a very good thing to happen, but really been very distressing, I think, for many Australians, particularly those who are survivors of abuse. I think on Pell, I suppose the obvious answer is the Royal Commission has to do its work and make its findings, and you wouldn't want to prejudge that. What I can say is when I watched aspects of the evidence, including the answer that you've just given, I thought it would be very difficult if you were a survivor to forgive that.
Mia Freedman.
I think that, as Penny said, you know, what happens to Pell from here and the findings of the Royal Commission are best left to them. But I was struck, as I think anyone with an ounce of humanity was struck, by the absolute lack of compassion, empathy, understanding, sensitivity, humanity shown by Pell when he spoke about things that were so heinous as to almost defy comprehension. And I think that for survivors, we expect from our religious leaders some leadership, some empathy and some understanding, and I think that it was just quite flabbergasting to see his arrogance and his complete lack of understanding of the real pain, devastation and in many cases, loss of life that have been caused by what happened.
Michaelia Cash, what do you think? And we'll go to the question as well, which is, do you think that he should lose his job or be removed from his position?
In relation to that, that is obviously got nothing to do with us as a panel here. But I am a Catholic, and I've obviously spoken to a lot of my fellow Catholic friends. I think despite what you've said, Alan, in terms of Pell was only 28 at the time, what we've all seen over the last few weeks, over the last few years, is, as Mia said, it was that complete lack of empathy. Jesus, at the end of the day, was someone who had compassion and who had empathy. I would expect nothing less from the leaders of our church, especially for those victims, in verbalising what they went through, to at least show them compassion and empathy. And I think why there is currently so much criticism of George Pell is because, despite what he may or may not have known, it is the way that he has approached the victims of the Royal Commission. And he hasn't, I don't believe, reached out to them and said, I feel your pain, as Jesus would have. He's just completely being totally, almost, there's just nothing there. And I think that has played against him.
And isn't one of the issues also more generally, is it is not just the lack of compassion and empathy which people perceive and feel. There is a sense of avoidance of responsibility.
Same thing.
You know, that no one ever says, yes, we were, you know, even though we did not perpetrate, we are responsible for failing to protect children. And people are waiting for that.
I don't think any decent, reasonable person disagrees with any of that. I'm just simply saying Archbishop Little was the Catholic Archbishop then, and of course he, as the evidence has indicated, covered up all of this stuff, protected people, kept on moving them around to parish. When Little then was replaced by Pell, and Pell became the Archbishop of Melbourne, Pell immediately did something about it, and I think that seems to be overlooked. I agree that the way in which he goes about it and the reaching out stuff is something that he seems uncomfortable with. But I think once he replaced Archbishop Little, who had covered up all of that stuff within the church, there was some action taken within the church, albeit belatedly.
Yeah, I think we can focus until the cows come home on the exact qualities or problems with Archbishop Pell. I think more relevant is that he is part of an institution which systematically protects child rapists and has a long history of doing so. I've interviewed... So on HuffPost Live, I interviewed Marcia Hamilton, who's the lawyer in the United States who's taking the Vatican to court to try to seek justice for the victims of child rape in the church. And one point she makes is, just imagine if this wasn't a religious institution. Imagine this was a childcare, this was Boys R Us, the international childcare chain. And it had created such a legal system that all of the people who were actually in charge of its childcare centres weren't employed by the head office. So you had plausible legal deniability. And people could say, well, I mean, how could Pell possibly have known? He's not really an employee. And the CEO, when the whole scandal breaks and it turns out that there have been millions of people raped around the world in this organisation, the CEO says, oh yeah, well, although the people who actually run the individual units wear our uniform, abide by our instruction manual, take instructions from head office, hire and fire who we say they should hire and fire, we're not legally responsible for anything that they do. I mean, that place would be shut down in a heartbeat. All of its leaders would be in jail. And the only way they've been able to get out of it legally is because they've structured the church in such a way that they are not legally culpable. But I tell you what, if there is a higher court, which the church seems to believe in, you would imagine that Cardinal Pell is going to have his day.
All right. Thank you. We'll move on. Our next question is a video. It's from Justin Mohammed, the CEO of Reconciliation Australia.
The recent State of Reconciliation in Australia report tells us that reconciliation between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous Australians will not take place until there is historical acceptance. We're all Australians, understand and accept the wrongs of the past, and we ensure that these wrongs are never repeated. Mr. Jones, do you understand your call for another stolen generation, which has a legacy of trauma and loss that affects so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to this day diminishes our nation's capacity for reconciliation.
Alan Jones.
Right, well, the comments I made were a consequence of comments which I'm happy to share made by the Indigenous leader of the Northern Territory, because there was a lot of talk about Indigenous children in particular. And I get this stuff across my desk every day. And Adam Giles said that he would remove neglected Aboriginal children from their parents and put them in adoptive homes. He said, "You mean to tell me, when we have all these alleged cases of chronic child sexual abuse, children running around on petrol, going on the streets at night, sexualising themselves in some circumstances, and there's only one permanent adoption for fear of stolen generation, that is not standing up for kids?" Now, Prue Goward, when she was a very good Minister for Community Services in New South Wales, said that in New South Wales alone, there were 1,100 children born to drug-addicted mothers, and the disposition of the courts is to leave them with their biological mothers. I was making a comment there that if the courts took action against the parents in favour of the children, they were, according to Adam Giles, frightened of being regarded as creating another stolen generation. And I believe we've got an obligation to say these children deserve a better chance, whether they're Anglo-Saxon children or Indigenous children. And that's precisely what Adam Giles said. And yet he said there's only one permanent adoption for fear of stolen generation. That is not standing up for kids. And that was the guts. So I've said all this before, and I say it again. When are we going to say we can't visit the errors and omissions, the violence, the drug-related behaviour of parents? We can't be visiting that upon our children, whether they're Indigenous children or not.
So are you saying that the problem here, as perceived by most people, is that you've chosen the wrong set of words when you said we need stolen generations?
Well,
because that has a resonance for
yes,
people.
I know it does, but
way beyond what you just explained.
No, but I know, Tony, but Adam Giles said if you dared to do this, to take these Indigenous children away from intoxicated parents, violent parents, if you dared do that, you'd be frightened of being called part of a stolen generation. Now, we've got to understand that many of these children who were taken away, and that's certainly what Bringing Them Home said as well, were taken away for their betterment. We had departments of public education, they were called then, and the departments of public education were particularly disposed to trying to give Indigenous children opportunities that their parents didn't have, or that they couldn't get from the environment in which they were placed. And that's Adam Giles is an Indigenous leader. He made the very point. And I think Anthony Warren...
Alan, I might just cut you off there because that's a strong point you've just made. I want to hear from some other panellists. Penny Wong.
Well, a few things. First, in a discussion about child protection, I think race plays no part. So we should not be talking about the children of Aboriginal Australians or Asian Australians or other ethnicities in the way that we often appear to talk about the children of Aboriginal people. That's the first point. I think that the second is, as the gentleman pointed out in the video, if reconciliation does require us to be honest and clear about what has gone before and to be respectful about what we connote when we use certain words. And the phrase stolen generations, even if, and we can have a discussion about whether it was well-intentioned, Alan, but I think we all know, it is well documented what that has meant in terms of the ongoing experience of so many of our first Australians. If we are going to have genuine reconciliation, we have to be honest with ourselves about what this society did impose on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and what it meant to be part of the stolen generation.
Michaelia.
Well, of course we don't want another stolen generation, but I accept Alan's explanation for his comments. But I think the broader picture is, and I think we'd all agree here, all children deserve to be safe. And as a government and as a society, we should take what steps are necessary to ensure that they are kept safe. I deal a lot in the domestic violence space. You know, some of what I see, it absolutely horrifies me in terms of some conditions that children are within. Doesn't mean that you take them away from their family forever, of course not. But does it mean that regardless, as Penny said, of race, of ethnicity, it does not matter? Do we, each of us here, have a responsibility to ensure that children in Australia are in the safest possible environment they can be? Yes, we do.
I don't want to dwell on this, but it was, in fact, John Howard's argument as Prime Minister was rather similar to what Alan Jones just said, without some of the rhetoric. I mean, his argument was that a lot of these Indigenous children were taken away by well-intentioned people, and he therefore refused to apologise for many years. Do you think now that we've gone beyond that?
Gone beyond?
Well, we've had an apology, I presume.
Your party's failure to apologise.
Oh, no, not at all. I think, Penny, you know...
Have we gone beyond that? I think it's the question.
No, hold on. Just hold on.
No,
you look at the latest statistics that have come out in relation to Indigenous people. You listen to what the questioner just said. A mere apology at the end of the day does not fix a problem. It's nice to sit there and gloat and say that it does, but it doesn't.
I'm not gloating.
You need to back everything up with policy. And I hope that all of us here could agree that in relation to the Indigenous people, we still have so far to go, and we should all commit to implementing good policy that is going to make a difference, and not just sitting here and talking in words and rhetoric, because at the end of the day, that is not going to make a difference.
Well, why don't you tell them about the $500 million you've cut from Aboriginal programs since you came to office? Why don't you tell them about that, Michaelia? Because I tell you what, I'm happy to back rhetoric with policy, but that actually means putting the investment and stopping taking the money out of these communities and the services they need. OK, we'll get back to the question. We'll hear from other panellists. Josh Zepps.
Well, I mean, what's the question here? Is it helpful to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for remarks like Alan's to be made? No. I mean, like it or hate it, the reality is I think it's extremely callous to belittle the suffering of people whose families were torn apart. I completely take, Alan, your point that oftentimes these were people who were not living in ideal circumstances. But if that's the case, then you have social services react to each individual case on its individual merits. You don't just regard an entire race of people as being culpable and worthy of being split apart. I don't even know why this is still something that's coming up in 2016.
Josh, no one is belittling anybody, and I will say this. To inject a personal element, since it's become a little personal, I'll stack my commitment to Indigenous Australians in terms of cash and kind against anybody else. I actually
I'm not as rich as you, Alan, so I can't.
Hang on, I've seen these people, and I've sought very significantly to alleviate the suffering in a real way, the kind of way that Michaelia talks about, not just by talking about it, but actually doing something about it.
We've got a questioner there with a hand up, sort of bursting to jump out of a chair, so go ahead quickly.
The profundity of the redress is so significant that born in 1970, I wasn't even taught that under British law in 1788 it was illegal to dispossess Indigenous people in this country under British law. Hence the question from QC Gartnettheim to Henry Reynolds, what would happen if Aboriginal people appealed to the High Court and said, we never agreed to your legal system here? And the response was, well, we can't rule against a legal system where we're undermining our very own existence. They're not even taught. I'm 45 and I was not even taught that. When he talks about, the gentleman talks about addressing the past, the profundity of that dispossession played out over 200 and whatever years now.
OK,
so
you've almost made your way onto the panel there. That's, I can take that as a comment, a profound one, and we'll move on to another subject. The next question is from Maddie Mott.
Michaelia, I'm just wondering how you can be Minister for Women yet not be a feminist. A feminist is someone that believes in the social, political and economic equality of the sexes. Do you not believe that women should have the same rights as men, or do you believe Australia has reached gender equality?
Absolutely do believe that when in Australia we say men and women are equal, I want to ensure that they are. I am fundamentally committed to gender equality. And I see the responsibility that I have as the Minister for Women as being a great one. Do I think that I can be the Minister for Women, be passionate about my commitment to gender equality, put in place policies that will ensure that as Australians we move towards gender equality and yet not be a feminist or not label myself a feminist? Yes, I do.
Why are you so scared of the word?
Choose. Mia, I'm not scared of the word. We discussed this beforehand. No, quite literally. That is a label. I don't label myself. I don't label myself.
Can I just say, it's all very nice to have private conversations, but we're actually here to discuss it on the panel. So let's go to Mia Freedman.
I was going to say, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. You're a feminist,
You can call me a feminist. You can call me a feminist. It does not, but the mere fact that I don't label myself as such does not mean that I do not get up every single day and fight for equality. One of the reasons I was so delighted to take on this role was it meant that I could do something in relation to domestic violence. We put domestic violence under this government at the forefront of national conversation. We announced $100 million women's safety package. So merely because I don't label myself as a feminist, because I don't believe in labels, does not mean that I don't get up every single day and fight for gender equality.
All right, our questioner Maddie has a hand up. Go back to you, Maddie.
Do you not believe that the Minister for Women should be at least willing to label herself as a feminist?
If it was if all you wanted me to do was label myself as a feminist and then step away and say my job was done, that'd be the easiest thing I could do.
Sounds like the same sorry argument, Michaelia. Sounds like the same sorry argument.
We just call ourselves feminists, then lounge around and have a coffee.
Yeah, because words don't achieve anything, words achieve nothing.
No, not at all. As I said, and you know what's amazing? The people who judge me are the people here. You're laughing at the fact that I don't call myself a feminist.
Let's actually go.
I don't label myself, but I can tell you, I get out there and I passionately pursue gender equality every single day, and that's what you want.
Let's talk specifically about gender equality. We have a good question from Jane
really
Bowen.
Like to respond,
Okay, you can.
Yeah, come on.
All right, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, we'll. Okay, I'm overruled. Go ahead.
Overruled. Do you want to go first, Mia?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Penny. I think by that definition, which I share, that political, social, economic equality of the sexes, everyone on this panel, including Alan, is a feminist. Alan, you a feminist?
I hope so. I certainly believe in gender equality, I can tell you.
There you go.
That will be the headline news tomorrow. Alan Jones says he's a feminist.
And it troubles me that Alan Jones is willing to label himself a feminist, but our Minister for Women isn't. And I'm not saying that you don't act like a feminist and walk the talk of a feminist, Michaelia, but I think that words are important, because if you reject the word, it kind of suggests, as our questioner said, that you think our work is done. And I think that feminism is just a term for people who believe that we've come a long way, but that we've also got a long way to go. And I think that, in my experience, women who deny the word, they're not running from the meaning of the word, as you are not. You're running from the perception of it. And I think it's a really outdated perception that feminism is about angry women, or that it'll alienate men somehow, or that it'll offend men. And I think that you don't have to be scared of that word, because no one thinks that feminism is that anymore.
Penny Wong, you did want to get in.
I do. This is very important. I call myself a feminist because it associates me with a set of political beliefs that I believe very passionately in. It is also an act of respect. It is recognising that the reason I can run for Parliament, that I can vote, that I can have equal pay, that we have women's refuges and so forth, is because women went before me and fought for those rights. You know, that's why we're in Parliament. It is. And again, I think the Dale Spender quote is the one I always think says it all. Feminism has fought no wars, killed no opponents, set up no concentration camps, starved no enemies, practised no cruelties. Its battles have been for education, the vote, better working conditions, safety on the streets, for childcare, social welfare, women's refuges and law reform. If someone says I'm not a feminist, I ask, what is your problem?
I was going to, Alan, I'm going to go quickly. I want to confirm what you said earlier. So you are, in fact, or do identify as a feminist? Is that right?
I agree with everything that Peta said. I find this a bit difficult in a way.
You're between the two of us.
I employ... No. But I'll give you an example at a personal level, which was a bit of a jest. I've had two women recently working for me who told me that I'm pregnant, we're going to have a baby. So I looked at them and I said...
They told you you're pregnant?
And I said to them, well, you must understand one thing. I said, once you have the baby, there'll be no job for you here. And their faces dropped, you see. And I said, no, I was only joking. But I'll tell you what, there won't be a job for you here if you put the job ahead of the baby. I want both to work, but the baby is really important to you. And I think that we have to get to the point whereby, I think you've got to break this down into small social components. Does the woman in the family feel that she has equality? Does the girl in the classroom feel she's got equality? Do the women in the workplace? And if not, why not? And what's being done about it? I think it's awful for people to feel simply because of their gender they're a second-class citizen. So if you hold those views of equality, I'm happy to be whatever tag you want to put onto me.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I'll look forward to that creche at your radio station as well. It'd be interesting to see you feeding alongside your
I do a bit
microphone. The next question is from Jane Bowen.
A report just out today states that gender pay inequality is so embedded in Australia that it could take generations to address. If feminism is all about advocating equal opportunities for women in all aspects of life, where is Australia really at with feminism now?
Michaelia Cash.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And you are right, the gender pay gap is way too high. And in fact, I saw a press release from Jed Carney of the ACTU today commenting on that latest information. And the final paragraph of Jed's press release, I think that we can all agree with. It is embedded. Structural, cultural and institutional. And that's why unravelling the gender pay gap is not as easy as it seems. It's also not just a role for government. It's not just a role for employers. It's not just a role for society. It's a role for every single one of us working together. And certainly from my perspective, the government needs to look at what levers it can pull to ensure that we are increasing women's workforce participation. So I think one of those levers is in relation to childcare. I've travelled around Australia now for 5 years, and I often sit down with parents and say to them, if there was one thing the government could change that would mean that you could participate in the workforce in the way that you want to, as opposed to the way that you have to, because of the institutionalised nature of childcare, what would it be? And they say to me, change the childcare system, Michaelia. So that is a lever that government can pull. And we are certainly trying to do that with our jobs and family package. There are other levers that the government can pull, the tax and transfer system, paid parental leave, flexibility within the workplace, getting rid of gender bias. How many times do you put in a resume, Susan or Sam? And the mere fact that there is gender within the resumes means that Sam's going to get chosen over Susan because of our unconscious bias. So there's a number of things that government can do, but government cannot do this alone. Each one of us has a role to play. And certainly it's working together and pulling the levers that each one of us can pull that we will move towards, I believe, gender equality. But in relation to the gender pay gap, you are right, it's still way too high.
I'll go back to Mayor Freedman on this, and the ACTU President Jed Carney, just quoted there by the Minister, said at every single stage, girls' and women's pay is way behind boys and men. In fact, she said young girls get 11% less pocket money, according to their study.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually that sounds sort of slightly naff, I suppose, that last bit, but if it is embedded in the culture somehow, how do you fix it?
All of us. Yeah, it's true, because a lot of times people say with the gender pay gap, it's because women take time out of the workforce to have children. But it's actually at every stage, way before they have children. So from the minute they leave university and they graduate, they start behind. And that goes all the way up to, at executive level, women are paid $100,000 on average less than men for doing the same job and being at the same level of qualification. So I agree with Michaelia, a lot of it is about unconscious bias. I'm just now thinking about how much pocket money I give my daughter. And I think I don't give her any, but that's because she's a second child and I just sort of forgot. But I think that, it shows that that's part of the reason that I call myself a feminist, and that there is a need to unite under a banner of feminism, I suppose, because there is still work to be done.
Yeah, Penny Wong?
Or just, look, the gender pay gap is just one of the markers of the way in which why feminism is still relevant. We can look at the number of women in the cabinet. At least we now have a woman as a minister for women. That's an improvement. But I don't think we should forget about the role of government in addressing some of the systemic issues which underlie this. Yes, there are a whole range of things which the private sector has to work together and so forth, but the reality is women are structurally disadvantaged in their participation in the economy. Women's work is valued less, so childcare workers are paid less than people performing similar and equivalent type of tasks in male-dominated industries. That's the reality. Now, in government, we did work with the pay equity case in the social and community services sector and assisted in funding pay increases in that sector to try and achieve better pay equity. I also make the point, superannuation. That's a huge issue, as Alan says, for women. We retire in general with far less in terms of retirement savings than men. One of the policies that the government removed that Labor put in place was the low-income superannuation contribution, which ensured that there was a tax benefit to low-paid people for superannuation, so that the concessions were not so skewed to the top end. The vast majority of the people who received that benefit were women, 2.1 million Australian women, and that's been reversed by this government.
But there's also a problem with super, isn't there, when women break their employment to have children, and if that woman has 5 children, then their superannuation doesn't accumulate, they lose a husband and they're left on their own simply because they chose to have children. The superannuation hasn't matched their employment record.
That's true.
Let's move to a different topic. The next question comes from Angela Casado.
My question is in relation to foreign ownership. Can the Employment Minister please describe how the recent approval to the $280 million sale of Australia's biggest dairy farming business to Chinese concerns is in the national interest? Whilst the largest proportion of foreign investment in agriculture has traditionally been from countries with similar value systems to our own, like the USA, the UK and Canada, investment approval of this type to a country with distinctly different socio-political values is likely to be of increasing concern to Australians, even to those who acknowledge the necessity and benefits of foreign investment.
Michaelia Cash.
Okay, great question and thank you very much. Foreign ownership, basically you have to go through a very strict process to be able to buy, in this case, Australian agricultural property. So the company itself had always been foreign-owned VDL. It was owned by New Zealanders. They put it up for sale, and obviously a Chinese company offered to pay, I think it was $252 million for it. 280 million. Thank you, Alan. That automatically triggers... He's primed and ready to go. That automatically triggers a review by the Foreign Investment Review Board. Okay, this government lowered the threshold at which that trigger for agricultural purchases would occur to $15 million. And I do note that the Labor Party did not support that. So, in relation to this particular acquisition, the Foreign Investment Review Board looked at it and they erred in favour of the sale. That is then presented to the Treasurer. The Treasurer reviews that. And he also has to look at whether or not it is contrary to the national interest. In this case, he determined that it wasn't. Now, let me tell you the conditions that the Treasurer has placed on
Can I just make one point here? That is the Treasurer that Alan Jones now calls the Wayne Swan of the Liberal Party.
Well, hold on, I have to say, he's put some fantastic conditions on this, which we should all be very proud of, because in Tasmania, it is going to create jobs. The Tasmanian Premier has come out and fully supported the sale. The 140 employees will continue to have jobs.
Okay.
The company, will also invest an additional $100
I'd like you to keep your answer a little more concise, just so we have time for other people.
She likes in Tasmania. That's a good thing for Tasmania. And I think the condition that the Treasurer imposed, which is they have to pay tax on every single dollar earned in Australia, is a good condition.
Alan Jones, that's a pretty compelling argument, wouldn't you say?
Michaelia, the only weakness in the question, if I might just say, is that you referred to it as investment, and there are people in Canberra who don't need a dictionary. They don't understand the difference between investment and ownership. We're all in favour of investment. Michaelia is not correct when she says there was a Chinese bid. The New Zealand company was first bought by an Australian company, and the bid was $280 million, and that was approved. The Chinese billionaire came in and gazumped the Australian bid, and we fell over ourselves to accommodate the Chinese bid. Jan Cameron then stumped up a $280 million bid, and the Treasurer wouldn't even see her. A very significant Australia, talking about gender equality, an Australian businesswoman, we don't talk to lobbyists, he said. Now, we're talking about an outfit which runs 29,000 dairy cattle over 19,000 hectares, producing 100 million litres of milk a year. Michaelia is saying, oh, well, one of the conditions placed on the sale is that the Chinese owners will have to pay tax on whatever they produce. That's correct. A tax assessed at the Australian market value. But in Asia, as everyone in this room knows, with an emerging middle class, 1.3 billion people, the product that we are producing here will sell in Asia at 3 times the price that you'd get for it here, and we are missing that economic benefit to this country. How on earth is that in the national interest? Now we've got the Kidman Empire, which is big as Ireland and Wales, and presumably Morrison is going to sell that in the national interest to China as well. I understand that Lindsay Fox has got a bid. This is ludicrous, and if it's OK, at what point isn't it OK? So does the Barossa Valley
Alan,
go?
I'm going to ask you for the same concision that
sure.
I
just say 2 things. Does the Barossa Valley go? Do we sell the Opera House? What don't we sell? Where do we put in the full stop if we don't put it in here?
OK. All right. I don't know if you want to deal with the Chinese Opera House or just the issue.
At the end of the day, we have very strict rules and regulations in relation to foreign investment and foreign ownership in Australia. I don't think Penny would disagree to say governments welcome foreign investment, but it's got to be not contrary to the national interest. And in this case, it was not. And Ellen, I see you smiling there, but go down to Tasmania, talk to Will Hodgman, talk to the Treasurer, talk to the employees who are now going to have their jobs. And they are all saying,
you mean they wouldn't have had them under an Australian owner? Give me a break.
It is a good thing.
OK, I'm going to bring Penny Wong in here. I'd like to hear... where do you fall in this argument? You're in the middle of it right now.
Right now I'm in the middle of it. It's a bit like Senate question time, you know. Michaelia's telling everybody what she thinks in great detail. Very slowly.
That's not fair. She was speaking very fast.
I was speaking very fast. Exactly. Let's be honest.
I don't share Alan's views, but he knows this. I mean, I was interested in the way you constructed the question because you said, you know, China essentially is a different political system, so therefore we shouldn't have their investment. I might be truncating what you said a bit. We have needed foreign capital since white arrival in this country. Our economy has always required more capital than we could raise ourselves, and that investment has meant Australian jobs. And if we say no, you know, a bar on foreign investment, I'm not suggesting anybody's saying that, but a complete bar is essentially saying we want to grow more slowly and have a higher unemployment rate. And I understand, appreciate that. I understand there are concerns about particular entities being sold to foreign interests. I would make the point that a great deal of Australian industry and Australian agriculture has been foreign owned, but by other nations, by Britain, by the United States. We should have sensible rules around foreign investment, but I do not start from the position that I think it's a bad thing. I start from the position that says if we have investment coming into this country that enables us to grow our industries and employ more people and grow our economy, then I think that's a good thing.
Okay, it doesn't matter who runs the country if we don't own it. No one's talking about investment. We're not talking about investment. We're talking about ownership. It doesn't matter who runs this country if we don't own the country.
Okay,
I just want to know where the full stop's going to be put in.
Alan, we're going to go from foreign ownership to foreign jobs. The next question's from Matthew Lawrence. Go ahead.
Yeah, good evening. I'm an unemployed Australian merchant seafarer. Why would any government in their right mind replace tax-paying Australian seafarers with exploited foreign seafarers working on 457 visas, working for as low as $2 an hour?
Good question.
Alan Jones, we'll start you off on that.
Well, it's obvious. I mean, there's no answer to your question. Absolutely ludicrous. Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, we're talking earlier on about gender equality. What about employment equality? Where is someone actually supporting Australian jobs? We pretend we're about it, and at the first snap that we get a chance, the opposite happens. The man's got an unanswerable question.
So you're essentially backing the MUA's campaign?
Look, I don't care whose the campaign is. If someone's right, you back. If I think someone's right, I back them. I don't care whether they're unionists or what they are. And I think in this instance, that bloke's supporting Australian jobs and the capacity to take home a pay packet for his wife and kids, and he's being gazumped by someone who comes in more cheaply. I mean, the thing is happening all the time, in a sense. The free trade agreements are fine, you know, but how does an Australian company compete when it's rightly paying good wages so that people can have a dignity and a decent style of life in this country, and yet competing with countries who are importing stuff into Australia where they're paying their workers nothing?
Michaelia Cash.
Thank you very much for the question. Just to be sort of sure here, everything that you're referring to is currently happening under the legislation that the Labor Party brought in 2012.
But the licences that
have been granted are allowed to be granted under Labor's legislation. The coalition government has made no changes to the coastal shipping laws. So everything you're referring to is happening
Would you like to? Do you think you should?
Yes, we would, absolutely, because we believe that shipping needs to be competitive. Can I just give you some statistics?
Sorry, do you, just to pick up Alan Jones's point and our questioners, do you think it should be Australian seamen on these vessels?
I think that we need to ensure that we are internationally competitive, because if we are not, you will see far more jobs lost in Australia. Coastal shipping in Australia is on the decline, and it's on the decline because of the legislation that the Labor Party brought in. The number of vessels has gone from 30 down to 15. I'd be worried about that as well. But everything that is occurring under the 2012 legislation.
Okay, just pause.
I want to see coastal shipping in Australia competitive.
Michaelia, just pause you for a second. Now, I'll come back to you because we don't want people yelling out, but you can quickly respond to that. Go ahead.
Thank you. You know, how can we compete with $2 an hour? It's impossible. What can you pay a mortgage, your child's education, hospitals on $2 an hour? Can you compete with $2? And just, you know, the 457 visa, that was supposed to be brought in to pull up a slack in a shortage of labour, not to replace Australian workers. It was here to replace a skilled shortage. So if there was no workers available in Australia, yeah, sure. But as long as they're paid Australian rates and conditions, not to be brought in on...
457 workers, they have to be paid Australian rates and conditions. And in fact, they're actually, by law, they have to be paid above that.
Some are not even being paid.
457 workers account for less than 1% of Australia's workforce. Under the coalition government, the number of 457 people coming to Australia has declined from that under Labor, where it effectively doubled when Labor was in office.
I'm just going to, because you did mention the Labor Party before, in fact, blame them for the situation. So, Penny,
it's your legislation. It's your legislation.
Let's be clear. What is happening, you know, on the MV Portland? What is happening in terms of coastal shipping under this government is a deliberate government policy. It is a deliberate decision to not prioritise Australian jobs, but to enable foreign workers on foreign crewed vessels to operate domestic routes. Now, our view is, and Michaelia says, oh, it's your act. The truth behind that, everyone, is that they couldn't get the numbers in the Senate to change the legislation, so they've done it via the back door, via licences that they're issuing.
The licences
so let's be really clear. Well, it is a change of policy which were never issued under us. So let's be clear. Now, our view is we should think about domestic shipping in the way we think about the Hume Highway or our railway drivers. You know, you have to have an Australian licence, they're crewed by Australian workers on Australian wages and conditions. Why we would allow a situation where we have people, foreign crews, when Australians are available, who are not required to observe the same conditions that Australian seafarers are employed under, why we would voluntarily say we have to have them in the system because we have to be internationally competitive when the US doesn't do it and a number of other
get this bloke a job tomorrow? This is the issue.
Countries don't do it.
Who gets this bloke a job tomorrow? This bloke's been run out of town by cheap labour. That's the issue. I mean, we can talk till the cows come home.
OK, it's time. We've got time for one last question, a very different subject, from Imogen Hooper.
Josh, my question is to you. Do you believe the claims that Donald Trump might be a secret Democrat working from the inside to destabilise the Republican Party so that they can win?
I hadn't heard that.
Sort of feels that way at the moment, doesn't it? No, I don't. But I do think that he is symptomatic of something that is interesting about American politics, which is that it is fundamentally broken. And I think Australian politics is also fundamentally broken. I think it would be a mistake to read too much into his candidacy other than the fact that Americans are sick and tired of being lied to by politicians. They're sick and tired of the artifice of politics. And, you know, it's the same here. I remember a few years ago I was watching Q&A and Penny was on, and I'm not going to... This is not just because of you. This is not a personal jab. But
Sounds
it was
like
when the Labor Party was against gay marriage still. And so Penny was put in the position of having to defend the Labor Party's policy. And as she's talking about how she believes in traditional marriage, it's like, you know, in a nature documentary where you see an injured gazelle, like in a mud flat, just sort of flailing around. It was like that, except the gazelle is pretending to enjoy the mud bath.
Josh, a lot of people are asking themselves right now how you got from Donald Trump to Penny Wong. And,
I'm asking that.
So, you know, my point is that there is a political consensus, which is this mud pool analogy. And, you know, when Penny has to say that, but she knows she's full of it, and we know she's full of it when we hear her say that. And she knows that we know she's full of it, and we know she knows that we know she's full of it.
We did manage to change the party's position, Josh.
Yes,
you might recall.
Let's get some... You've just come from New York, as far as I know. So give us some sort of insight into why it is that Trump is not only winning currently the nomination, or that might be a contested convention, but he could end up being the Republican candidate for president, a man who wants to build a giant wall between two countries, etc., etc.
Well, Trump is the lion by the mud pool, Tony, who points out the flailing animals and says, why do we even have the mud pool anyway? Look at all these losers who are flailing around in there. Why do we have these rules of consensus? Why can't we just say what we want to say, do what we want to do? And I think that appeals. And I have been wrong about Trump so much that I daren't make any predictions. But it does look, we'll know basically a week from tomorrow there are going to be a few big states voting, Florida and Ohio. And it may be that in a week from tomorrow we will essentially know that he's going to be the Republican nominee. It certainly looks that way.
Could he become president?
Well, I didn't think he was going to get the nomination. So you're asking the wrong guy. Yes, I think that if you had a conventional Republican, then Hillary has this absolutely locked up. The demographics are very much in the Democrats' favour. It's a bad year for Republicans. The field is not strong. And so the consensus has always been that Hillary sort of has this in the bag. But if what Trump's appeal is that he's anti-establishment, that he's completely different, that he's not like all of the people who you know, well, who is the most establishment candidate in the whole United States? It's Hillary. And I just also note that if Trump gets the nomination, he will be the most unpopular. His unfavourability ratings will be the highest of any presidential candidate in American history. And you know who will be the second most unpopular?
Tony Abbott.
Hillary Clinton.
Mia, since you yelled.
Sorry. It's so interesting. I think that Josh is right, that there's a real disillusionment with politicians. And I think that's why we're seeing the rise of micro-parties. We're seeing people like Clive Palmer. We had our own disastrous experiment with Pauline Hanson. And I'm really reminded of that with Trump, because every time Pauline Hanson would say something really ignorant, everyone would go, oh, well, now the polls will go down, people will see, and people just loved her more. Her popularity just went up, the less she sounded like a politician. And I think that Trump is riding on that. But what's interesting about Hillary is how she's not resonating with younger women. And I think that younger women are saying, firstly, they don't want their mother's candidate. And secondly, they're really disillusioned with political dynasties, like where they had the Bushes and there's the Clintons.
You have to imagine they wouldn't vote for Donald Trump unless they happen to be married to him.
But they love Bernie Sanders. They love Bernie Sanders because, ironically, if he becomes president, he'll be the oldest president ever. But even though...
What's not to love?
But they feel like he's more radical than Hillary because he is. He's far more left-wing. But he seems like their cuddly granddad. So it's kind of like the safe protest vote. But I think Hillary will get the Democratic
Till you
nomination.
ask him where he stands on gun laws, then he's not quite so cuddly. Hey, Alan, what do you think about Donald Trump, man of the people or dangerous, unstable egomaniac?
Well, I think Josh is right here. I was reading a thing in the New Yorker magazine which said that the Trump supporters, it was a hilarious story, have had it with, and it listed them, anyone named Bush, anyone named Clinton, anyone who's held political office, political correctness, illegal immigration, massive unemployment, phony official unemployment and inflation figures, welfare waste and fraud, Wall Street crooks, Michelle Obama's vacations, Barack Obama's golf, Hollywood hypocrites, cop killers, that goes on. And this is the point. I mean, I think the bloke's a bit of a lunatic. But he's entertaining. But, you know, whether or not this... There's no way in the world he's going to become president, and I agree with whomever said it. I think you're right. Hillary is not getting the votes of the young women, but I think that most probably, at the end of the day, there's no opposition.
Let me just say, it's not inconceivable that he could become president simply because there is a sense that every politician is manipulating voters, right? But he comes out and he manipulates you openly standing at a podium. Here we do it in back rooms, right? And there's an appeal to that.
But I think the questioner was asking, it wasn't the questioner asking whether, and I was saying this to Mia, whether some Democrats, because if you register as a Republican, you can vote. Are there Democrats registering as Republicans so that Trump gets up?
Well, some states have open primaries and you're actually allowed to vote for whomever.
Yeah. I'd love to go to the flailing gazelle or the slow-speaking, fast-speaking
No one's actually ever called me that before.
but that's all we have time for. I'm so sorry about that. Please thank our panel, Josh Zepps, Michaelia Cash, Penny Wong, Alan Jones, Mia Freedman. Thank you. Now, next Monday, we will put politics aside for a special science edition of Q&A with world-renowned physicist and string theorist Brian Greene, dark matter and energy cosmologist Tamara Davis, marine ecologist and presenter of Coast Australia Emma Johnston, molecular biologist and science communicator Upali Divisekera, and Australia's chief scientist Alan Finkel. Until next week's Q&A, good night.